It is my honor to welcome our distinguished speakers, Broward County Superintendent of Schools, Robert Runcie, Dr. Patricia Tish Jennings, Judge Steven Leifman, and Dr. Judson Brewer. It is our intention this evening to illustrate for you a clearer picture of mindfulness-based programs and how they can impact and benefit the life cycles of mental health and mental illness. Beginning before birth, continuing throughout adulthood to end of life. How mindfulness can result in prevention, intervention, rehab, recovery, healing, and the beginning of a new life. She is a founding member of the Broward County Public Schools Superintendent's Mindfulness Initiative, and now will introduce to you Broward Superintendent of Schools, Robert Runcie. So Knellee, please.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Valerie, for that generous introduction. And I just want to thank you for everything that you have done for this community from a long time ago before mindfulness was mainstream. So can we just give Valerie a round of applause for this event and for all of the work that she's done. So it is a huge honor and privilege for me today to introduce to you one of our speakers, Superintendent Robert Runcie, especially as someone who has grown up practicing mindfulness and to be able to see this being taught in schools and taught throughout the community. So as a leader of the nation's 6th largest school district with more than 271,000 students and 36,000 employees, Broward County Public Schools Superintendent Robert Runcie is committed to the district's vision of educating today's students to succeed in tomorrow's world. Superintendent Runcie knows firsthand how a high-quality education can transform a person's life. Born in Jamaica, he moved to the United States as a young boy and became the first member of his family to attend college, graduating from Harvard University and earning an MBA from Northwestern University. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming Superintendent Runcie.
Thank you so much, Knellee, and welcome and good evening, everyone. Thank you, Virginia and Gus, and everyone who's worked to put on this event tonight. This is a great place for us to be tonight and a great way to start our weekend. I think we're all where we need to be in life. And I am enormously proud to be here today to witness and celebrate the growth and elevation of mental health and wellness, and mindfulness is a topic of significant focus and attention for school districts and education leaders, our community, and the country at large. So let's reflect for a moment on the moment we're in and just think about this. Broward County voters passed a referendum in August of 2018 to provide funding for increased mental health services in our public schools. And by the way, we're the only district in Florida to put mental health and wellness on a referendum to be funded by voters. And just a few months ago, not many months ago actually, maybe about 4 or so, our school board approved a $16 million additional investment in mental health services. And thank you. I doubt that if I were to roll back time to a decade ago or earlier, that we would have been able to pull that off, especially during an era and time where talking about mental health was taboo. And in fact, I think if I would go to my school board and say, hey, we want to spend $16, $20 million on mental health and wellness, I'd probably be run out of town. But times have changed, and it's because of where we are at this moment that we are in Broward County. We have a unique opportunity and a unique responsibility to help, I believe, lead this nation and our school districts in an area of education that I believe is fundamental and needs to be at the forefront. The importance and the relevance of mental health, mindfulness, social emotional learning is not some new revelation in Broward County Public Schools, nor it is a fad. The reality is that Broward County had a significant focus on mental health and wellness and mindfulness prior to the Parkland tragedy on February 14, 2018. And those efforts that we had in place helped us to navigate our way through the tragedy, and we continue with those efforts expanded today. And we were doing what we were doing, and I'll go through some of those things. We were doing that without any funding from the state of Florida for mental health services in our public schools. So our work in this space is driven by our belief that access to mental health and wellness services isn't a luxury, but a necessity for ensuring educational equity and justice for all students. Because you see, you can't participate fully in the educational process, in the process of learning, if you're not present and your mind is distracted by fear and trauma. It's just not gonna happen. And we spend enormous amounts of treasure and resources to provide interventions to students in our classroom because they can't sit still and they're not focused on the learning. We need another approach, and I believe that this work that many of you do, that we're continuing to push in our district, is a way to really accelerate the progress that we've seen for our kids and do something really special. Recent reports have confirmed that our current generation of young people are the most stressed in history. Longitudinal national surveys show a 50% increase in major depressive disorders between 2011 and 2015 among our teens. And the suicide rate for 12 to 14-year-olds has doubled since 2007. We have so many students who are crying out for our help, but we have historically not heard their cry. Current estimates are that more than 60% of our public school students are impacted by one or more adverse childhood experiences, which we call ACEs, and that includes trauma connected with things like domestic violence, poverty, sexual, emotional, and physical abuse, or incarceration of a parent, to name a few. And let me share one young man's story. In 1967, a young boy immigrated to the United States from the birthplace of reggae music and some of the world's fastest sprinters. Can you guess? Jamaica. And although his family arrived with very few possessions, their hearts and minds were full of hope and ambition. His parents had no formal education beyond 3rd grade and zero financial net worth. But they came to America, they came to this country because they believed in the ideals spelled out in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States, and that if you work hard and you apply yourself, you can be successful in this land of boundless opportunity. Tragically, within a couple years after landing in New York, the family became victims of a hate crime when someone began shooting at his parents while they sat on the front porch of a duplex apartment that they rented. And they were sitting there. His parents would be there every Saturday reading the Bible every Saturday afternoon. Everyone escaped harm except for his mother, who was shot in the face and somehow escaped death after weeks in a hospital. The man who shot at them in his statement to the police, said that he was tired of Jamaican immigrants coming here and taking away our jobs. That young man's story is my story. That is my family. That is my mother. And it is frightening to hear the same hate-mongering rhetoric towards immigrants still going on today and flowing out the mouths of national leaders as freely as flash floods down Main Street after a storm. Now, I didn't receive any help, no counseling, no social worker, no therapy, nothing. We had to navigate through this trauma on our own. My parents showed me the meaning of courage as they demonstrated the power of forgiveness and grace in the face of such hatred. We moved on with our lives, and they never spoke about this person and horrible day again. As young children, it helped us to heal and focus on our lives and our futures. Since then, I've dealt with innumerable challenges and incidents of racism and microaggressions. I believe that God presents you with these tests to build our character, our humanity, and our leadership. It is because of what I've endured and learned that I'm determined to lead the way to a future where no student is dealing with traumatic experiences is left hanging out there, unable to receive help and support. If you believe it is time for universal health care in America, then you should believe it is time for universal health, mental health services and mindfulness program for all students in all of our public schools. Because I believe these programs and services must be fundamental parts of our curriculum. They're just as important and urgent as proficiency in literacy and math. You know, this week they came out with the PISA results, the international assessments, the program for international student assessments, where they do all 15-year-olds across the world and they rank all the countries. And, you know, America continues to wonder why we don't show up at the very top, right? And I believe that part of our problem is that we have almost a myopic focus on assessments, on accountability. Now, yes, you're gonna have you need some assessments, you need some accountability, but that can't be all there is to it. Those are the outcomes. We need to begin to focus on the inputs and the resources and the services and put our kids in a position to be successful. Because I believe also that the services that we're talking about will give our kids the most valuable skills that we can help them to develop. The capacity to deal with life challenges, disappointments, and loss, and to be able to learn from them and to be resilient. It's the greatest gift I believe we're going to be able to give our future generations. Technical skills, they can come and go, but life skills are what we need to live on and endure. So let me give you a sense of some of the things that we were engaged in prior to our Parkland tragedy, as we have gone through the tragedy and what we've expanded into today. So prior to Parkland, we had a very big focus on mental health and wellness. In fact, we had started one of the major initiatives we did in 2016-17. We showed this film called Listen, in which we showed at every high school in Broward County to all our students. We even had 2 sessions during the day. During the day, we showed it in the schools. In the evening, we actually showed it in the community. We get parents involved. And the film really raised awareness about the importance of being attentive to others and identifying when someone is critically depressed, maybe suicidal. And it was really a great way to build awareness in our community. Around that year, I was also president of the state superintendent association called FADS, and in that role, I made mental health and wellness our priority agenda for that year. In fact, we actually had a major summit that we had in Tallahassee around that topic in January of 2017. We also continue to expand our core programs. I spent summer of 2015 in Aspen with the Aspen Education Institute, helping to develop the social, emotional, academic framework that is being used around the country. And we brought that back into Broward County and incorporated into our social, emotional learning curriculum and resources. We continue to expand our peer mentoring programs, such as Mentoring Tomorrow's Leaders, Latinos in Action, 5,000 Role Models we've also introduced in our district. They have that in Miami as well. We put these programs because we know how important it is for peers to help each other. And we also continue to expand and strengthen our network of community partners that included organizations such as the United Way. We worked and incorporated elements of the Sandy Hook Promise, Tomorrow's Rainbow, Children's Services Council, Memorial Hospital, and many others. We have implemented Hope Sunshine Clubs. These are clubs helping overcome problems effectively. We have that in 25 of our district schools. And we have a significant superintendent's mindfulness initiative, which we started in 2016-17 prior to Parkland, with the vision of introducing mindfulness, wellness practices within our schools and making that accessible to our students so that they can build their resiliency in communities which we know are really dealing with a lot of stress and a lot of challenges. We have provided that to children, teens, and teachers so they have access to mindfulness tools and practices in school. And we know that mindfulness is associated with stress reduction, increased job satisfaction and performance for our teachers, and better academic and life outcomes. And I'm going to share a story a little later about a teacher who's really been impacted by this. We've also worked again, as Knellee mentioned, with at.and, the district's healthcare company. They helped to put together a program with AHAM Education where we have daily practice tools through Inner Explorer is the program that we use within a district. And it's been utilized and accessed by hundreds of teachers and parents and employees and volunteers that have undergone training and continue to attend local monthly meditation sessions, the quarterly retreats by AHAM Education. And we continue to push that through all of our 236 schools in Broward County. So about February 14th and immediately following the tragedy in Parkland, we just mobilized every mental health related resource that we had in the county and to bear down in the Parkland community so that we could provide support. We established a wellness center which has provided thousands of hours of support on the campus. We established a resiliency center in the community where we provided thousands of hours as well to staff, students, and the community at large. We continue to provide support services, training on resiliency and suicide prevention. We put together a lot of full-time staff and clinicians, including trauma-focused and trained cognitive behavior therapists into the Stoneman Douglas zone. And in fact, we invested around $8 million in social workers and psychologists, adding about 50 district mental health staff to the Stoneman Douglas zone. At one point, we probably had maybe up to 30, 40 therapy dogs at the schools, and we still do have some there. And we've engaged national partners, such as the National Center for School Crisis of Bereavement. One story I'll tell you is that I was out in California about 3 weeks before the tragedy in January, meeting with the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, the Zuckerbergs of Facebook, asking them for funding to support some of our mental health and social emotional learning initiatives in Broward County. They contacted me about a week after the tragedy, and they knew this was an area of focus for us, and they funded a year's worth of support from the Center for Mind-Body Medicine. Some of you may be aware of them, founded by Dr. James Gordon, and they have been enormously helpful. They're one of the best in the world in terms of helping communities develop self-care and wellness strategies in areas such as Kosovo, the Middle East, Gaza, lots of adversely impacted areas of the world. They've been with us since 2018 in Broward County. So about a year out, I wanted to get a sense of, what has been the impact of tragedy and trauma on student performance and outcomes. And so one of the things we looked at were some of our state assessments, and we looked at them for the students at Stoneman Douglas High School. So I'll give you an example. The Algebra 1 end-of-course pass rates, which all our kids are required to take in order to meet their graduation requirements. The first-time pass rate in 2016-2017 school year for Stoneman Douglas High School was 65%. Not bad. 2018, that number was 69%. The year after the tragedy, the assessments they took after that, the pass rate was 20%. So some of you may not know, but Parkland is the highest wealth income zip code in entire Broward County. It's the most well-resourced community you can find. Parents, they got resources, they can give their kids whatever it is they need, tutors, supports. But if trauma can impact the most well-resourced kids that we have in our community to that dramatic extent, well, what's happening to all the other kids throughout Broward County, throughout your districts, throughout your communities who are dealing with trauma on their own? Again, it could be they're living in a home where there's domestic violence, they're dealing with homelessness and poverty. All of those things can impact student achievement. And so post-Parkland, we have, again, made it our top priority to address this issue of mental health, social emotional learning, invest in resources. The state has finally stepped up now. It took a crisis for them to actually recognize and understand that they need to invest in mental health services. So we have received about $5 million each of the last couple of years for mental health resources, in which we've invested into social workers, family counselors, school counselors, psychologists, and other therapists, added about 60 positions there. From the referendum that we passed within our community, it allowed us to allocate another $8 million and add another 90 positions as well. So these help us to reduce the caseloads and be able to have greater outreach and impact with our students. And through initiatives that we've continued, such as the Center for Mind-Body Medicine, we have students going through that now who are actually becoming what we call student ambassadors in each of their schools. So we're engaging our students to be not only recipients, but also deliverers, and really providing instruction to their peers on mindfulness, on wellness strategies within our schools. And if you talk to many students and you talk about this topic, they'll immediately jump to the fact that, hey, you got to go work on our teachers first, because they take out their issues on us quite a bit. And, I can recall in many meetings I had with the staff who were so impacted at Stoneman Douglas, and I would meet with them in an auditorium. And at one meeting, the year after we had the Center for Mind Body Medicine here, we offered a summer program, which is like 2 weeks with them that you go through. It's pretty extensive. And many of the teachers, they wouldn't take advantage of these services. And I remember one teacher who would yell and scream, and it looks like she was all ready to attack me every time she saw me on campus. So she went through the training, and so here I am at one of the meetings in the auditorium. I'm standing there, I'm just giving them updates, I'm checking in to see how they're doing, and at the end, she starts coming at me. So, I'm trying to figure out what may happen here in this situation. So she comes and she says, I want to thank you for the training that you made available to us over the summer with the Center for Mind Body Medicine. I was a skeptic at first, but I took it, and it has changed my life at home with my family. It's changed how I teach. And, I had one of the students that sometimes is forgotten, one of the students that was actually shot and injured and has been suffering enormous trauma. He was an A student, honor roll student, but now his grades have fallen. He's failing everything that was taking. Every time we did one of our emergency code drills, he would become re-traumatized. But she said that the practices that she learned there, she began to work with this student and help him to apply them. And she said, today he's back to being an A-rated student. He knows how to deal with trauma and stress. And she's like the biggest evangelist now for this work that we're doing. And she was a big skeptic before. So this is like serious work. And if it can have this kind of impact in the community, and that should be like one of the big takeaways that we have from Stoneman Douglas, right? It's not that we need to turn our schools into prison. We need to invest resources to help our kids deal with trauma and stress. And I'll just close with a few brief comments and just say that, I really believe in the power of this work to transform public education and secure our democracy, because it can help us to restore human decency, compassion, tolerance, and love, which is something that's really missing in this day in which we become more divided than ever. This work is about teaching people how to be better human beings. Author and opinion writer David Brooks, I actually heard him on the radio on NPR on the way here, I remember one interview he did, and he was talking about resume virtues versus eulogy virtues. And, our lives are ultimately not judged by our resume, what we own, how much money we make, our titles and our positions, how many tweets we post and how many likes we get, how much media coverage we get. It ain't about that. The impact of your life will be talked about at your eulogy, where people will reflect on how much your love affected them, how your ability to forgive and afford others grace and compassion helped them, how you help others to be their best, how you help someone's child to sustain hope while they struggle with homelessness. Your legacy will be about your character and your capacity for selfless, true love. And I'll leave you with a hopeful thought from my friend, Dr. James Gordon, again, founder for the Center for Mind Body Medicine. He's got a new book out. And he says, I believe that you will discover the hidden resources of physical and mental energy and hope, as well as the capacity to imagine and make use of perspective and solutions many have previously thought unthinkable. You may also, as shamans and spiritual teachers have long taught, discover in the ruins of trauma the treasure of meaning and purpose and love for others and yourself that will warm and brighten all the moments of your life. Again, thank you so much, and may God bless you for your commitment and this work that you do.
I don't have the full bio for Dr. Lawrence Feldman with me. It's very long. I'm going to keep this very short in introducing him. But I had wanted to bring him up or ask him to come up and say a few words to the community and to everybody that's here this evening. And so please help me welcome Dr. Lawrence Feldman.
You know, before I give you a few comments, and I'm not taking any of the guests' time right now, I must tell you one thing that's on my mind, because otherwise it won't be clear enough to even speak. I cannot get my jiggly belly back to where I wanted it. You know, when you listen to the words of Valerie, how we relaxed, and she said, just let it go, and it'll flow. It's hanging down by my knees. I'm in trouble. I don't know how to do this, honestly. Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I must thank a dear friend. I must thank you, Mr. Runcie, Robert. Your courage to stand in the face of such anger and frustration. Your courage to lead a school system that, quite frankly, experienced something that none other did. Your experience, your courage, your intuition, and quite frankly, your compassion has transformed Broward into a school system that all of us are proud of. We're proud of your work, we're proud of your history, and your legacy will in fact change a lot of lives. Ladies and gentlemen, our superintendent from Broward, please stand. One more time, Robert Runcie. I'm not here to speak for the superintendent. He is home ill. And I was very excited that you mentioned my name. I was sitting here having my ginger ale, and it's very exciting. I want to thank our guests here. I like you, this is a special moment in our lives. It's a special moment because we have 4 individuals who are known for what they've accomplished. They're known for the changes they have made, the positive changes they have made in each community in which they have worked. They are the folks that lead us with a set of values and goals and characteristics that make them folks we want to follow. But I don't want to also tell you, I don't want to leave you with the fact that maybe you think, well, Dade County doesn't do anything. We happen to have our own mental health department. We have worked very hard, everything that the Superintendent Runcie has said. We have also tried to accomplish in different areas. As a matter of fact, Sally Allian and her team are here tonight. They went through a mindfulness training program today with, I don't know, hundreds. That's a good number. Okay. Individuals so that they understand the importance. So Sally, with you and all your team, just stand up and just speak and say thank you to you. There are more, but they don't want to get up. So ladies and gentlemen, we have 2 individuals who put this together. As the host city and the host district, it's a great deal of pleasure and honor for me to say thank you to Gus and Valerie. They have worked tirelessly. There is nothing more important than what we are doing today. Each one of you made a choice, a conscious choice. Well, I don't know, you burned my arm, huh? Each one of you have made a conscious choice to be here instead of somewhere else. To make this time devoted to what we all hope you do, which is you stand up for every kid who doesn't have the strength to do it. You show up every day where you are, helping out a hand, raising someone to a level of compassion, understanding, and integrity. Quite frankly, you speak, each one of you, speak for those that are often unseen, for those that are most fragile, for those that don't have advocates, for those that silently suffer. Every one of you here are heroes. Every one of you have demonstrated a sense of integrity of the soul, of the spirit, compassion, and that is not found everywhere. And so I thank you for having the time, the energy, and the commitment to do what you do. Many times no one thanks you. Many times you go home tired, carrying the burdens on your shoulders of others. And when you get home, you just want a quiet moment to sit, reflect, and just think about your life. And then the phone rings and someone needs your help. That is not easy, but yet you do it. You do it without any kind of complaining. So to represent all of you, I would ask if you would allow me a personal moment and ask Gus and Valerie if you would come up here and join me for a moment. It takes too long if you go slowly. And in our school system, our school board has a practice of taking the time to say thank you to people who have dedicated their service to others before themselves, who have, quite frankly, worn their heart on their sleeve. And so it gives me a better idea. It gives me a great deal of honor to present this Dade County Public Schools medallion. It is not plastic, medallion for exemplary service to those before you do yourselves. Valerie and Gus, if you would, have never experienced a standing ovation. This is a perfect time to join us. Let's get up and say thank you appropriately to folks that put this together. So, whoever's on next, let's get ready. I will tell you this, may the Lord continue to keep each one of you in the palm of his hand and grant you peace and serenity. Thank you for allowing me.
Now you know why I asked Dr. Feldman to come up. That was a big surprise, however. But I did want to say that he was instrumental, truly, in this whole effort to bring mindfulness into Miami-Dade County Public Schools. So we owe you a big debt of gratitude. Yes. I first became aware of Dr. Tish Jennings and her CARE program in 2012 because I had begun teaching mindfulness-based stress reduction to educators in private schools here in Miami. At that time, there wasn't really very much out there to guide you, and there was a paper reviewing research and curricula entitled Integrating Mindfulness Training into K through 12 Education, Fostering the Resilience, which is what Dr. Runcie and Dr. Feldman are talking about. The resilience of teachers and students was published and included the work of Dr. Jennings. She is an internationally recognized leader in the fields of social emotional learning and mindfulness in education. Dr. Jennings started meditating at 17 and has been teaching mindfulness awareness to students and to educators for 40 years. Her research, she is a major researcher. Her research places a specific emphasis on teacher stress and how it impacts the social and emotional context within the classroom. Dr. Jennings is a member of the National Academy of Sciences Committee on fostering healthy, mental, emotional, and behavioral development among children and youth. Currently, she is leading a development of the Compassionate Schools Project curriculum, an integrated health and physical ed program designed to align state and national health and physical education standards, and is a co-investigator on a large randomized controlled trial to evaluate the curriculum's efficacy. Earlier in her career, Dr. Jennings spent 22 years as a teacher and a teacher educator. She has written several books, some of which will be on sale after our program next door and the book signing that Books and Books is helping us with. So please help me welcome Dr. Tish Jennings.
It's really a pleasure to be here today with all of you, and thank you, Gus and Valerie, for putting this on and inviting me down here to talk about how we can help our teachers and our students. But first, I'd like to ask a few questions. How many of you are educators or former educators? Lots of you. That's great. How many of you are other related support people for schools? You know, administrators, I guess those are educators too, maybe social workers, other mental health professionals. Oh, great. How many of you are parents? Okay. And how many of you were ever students in school? So you're really familiar with this territory, right? So as Valerie said in my introduction, I came to this work of practicing mindfulness a long time ago. And really similar to Superintendent Runcie, I also experienced some pretty severe trauma as a child. And that is actually what brought me to meditation at age 17. So I'm going to tell you my story briefly. So as a different context, my parents, I was born in Michigan. My father was a professor at the University of Michigan. We lived in a really nice house. We had a nice family. Something happened along the way, and my mother had mental health problems. And as her mental health deteriorated, she decided she wanted to move to Tucson, Arizona. I'm still not sure why. I was too young to know what was going on. But all of a sudden, we're moving to Tucson. And at that time, it felt weird because there was definitely tension, and my mother was acting strange. And I was 8 years old. I didn't know what was going on. And I have two younger sisters. So my mother flew out to Tucson, and then my sisters and I and my dad drove across the country. And that was quite an adventure, because my dad was one of these unusual people back in 1958 who owned a VW bus in Michigan. Anybody old enough to know that that is something really odd to do? I definitely don't buy Volkswagens in Detroit in 1958. But so that just telling you that tells you what my dad was like. He was a really visionary guy, really big thinker. And so we drove across the country in this Volkswagen bus that he had made into a camper. And we got to Tucson, and it was really disappointing because somehow in my head I thought we were going to the Wild West, which Tucson at that time was not the Wild West. So we end up in this little dinky apartment with my mom, and then my dad is crying, which he never did, and then he leaves in the Volkswagen bus and goes home. And we're like, now we're here in Tucson with our mom and our dad's gone. Well, a few weeks later, he died of an aneurysm, leaving us in Tucson, far away from any family, with a mother whose mental health was deteriorating pretty rapidly, and who also had substance abuse problems. And I'm the oldest. Well, long story short, after about 5-6 years of continuous trauma, living with this mother, moving from place to place, moving from school to school, experiencing some real difficulties in school and not having any support at all, my mother committed suicide when I was 15. So just like what Superintendent Runcie said, there was no support for any of us at that time. Nobody even paid any attention to us. They just thought, oh, she just can't pay attention. Oh, she's just stupid. Oh, whatever, oh, she'll be all right, whatever. And I was desperate for something to make sense out of my world, because my experience was that my whole world was shattered. I mean, literally nothing made sense anymore. And I was very fortunate to meet somebody who was taking a Zen meditation class at the community college. And I thought, this sounds interesting. And it was definitely difficult for a 17-year-old to sit and do Zazen, but it definitely helped me calm myself down and to begin to recognize that my thoughts were not me, that this anxiety that I was feeling was a normal experience given what happened to me, and that there was more to life than that. And I believe it gave me the resilience that I needed to get through and succeed in life. So I feel like in many ways, I am an example of how these practices can help our young people. So when I became a teacher, one of the things I was very committed to doing was helping students build these skills that I had learned later. So this is me in about 1982. I was a Montessori teacher. Those are my preschool kids, and I'm teaching mindfulness. That's the only picture I have of myself back then. But so I started doing this a long time ago. And I noticed something about myself, that when I was calm and centered and grounded and mindful, my students were more attuned to what I was doing with them. They were more connected. They were more engaged with me. And sometimes they weren't, but I was able to just be okay with that, Anyway, but later I started working in a teacher ed program. Any teacher ed people here? I just forgot to ask that. Okay, great. Oh yeah, we met. So I started supervising student teachers, and I spent a lot of years observing classrooms. And I started noticing something. I noticed that there was something about the stress in the classroom that was interfering with classroom management. Because I was teaching classroom management and I was observing people trying to manage behavior. And what I realized is that when you're in the midst of teaching with these incredibly intense demands, emotional demands, attentional demands, it feels like this. Anybody ever feel that way? It's not like that, but that's how it feels because it's so demanding. We have to pay attention to all these things going on simultaneously. We have to keep track of the time because we have to get finished by a certain bell. We have to manage the relationships among all of the students in our classrooms and our relationships with each one of them as well. And on top of that, we have to keep the content that we're teaching in our heads so that we can deliver it in the midst of all this. So what I realized in this process of observing was that teaching is an incredibly stressful profession and that nobody had really paid attention to that before. Wow, okay, but I knew that somehow my own mindfulness was helping me. And so I thought, well, maybe there's a way that mindfulness can help teachers. And so, ever feel that way? What I realized as I started studying stress, I went back to school and got my doctorate. And I studied stress and coping in adulthood because I thought maybe I'll find some solutions here. And what I realized is that we have this stress response. This is the fight, flight, freeze response. And it's built into our bodies. And it evolved to help us survive a lion chasing us. And there's a whole lot more to it than that. But when you're feeling stressed, your body goes through a whole response, physiological response, that makes it really hard to do anything but run or hide or do whatever you need to do. So when you're feeling threat or stress, it's very, very hard to manage academic learning. It's really, really difficult. When you're a student who's coming from a home where there's violence, poverty, other kinds of trauma, like I was living in, you come to school sometimes not feeling safe. When I was a kid, when I first came to school in this new town with these new people, I didn't feel safe. And so I was spending a lot of my energy kind of looking out and making sure that I was okay, right? And it was very hard to focus on academics. That was one tendency that I had. The other tendency I had was to dissociate, to just space out, which you probably also see with kids. They just check out. Because that's another way to protect yourself when you don't feel safe. It's a way of hiding or freezing. So I totally agree with what Superintendent Runcie said. I do believe that what underlies the scores that we see in this recent report is trauma, poverty, all of these factors, because kids can't learn when they don't feel safe. period. And with teachers having stress and burnout, it makes it even harder for kids to feel safe. So I realized that I had to work with the teachers first, because you can't ask teachers to teach mindfulness to kids if they're not being mindful themselves, because really a big part of the teaching is the person. The person is actually modeling for the kids what it means to be mindful and compassionate. You can tell kids to be mindful, but that won't really work. My friend Tim Ryan, who's a congressman from Ohio, one time he said, you know, we spend lots of time telling our kids to calm down and pay attention, but we never tell them how. We don't show them how you do that. So to be able to teach that, we have to know how to calm down and pay attention as well. So I started studying this burnout process, and I found that there's this cascade effect of stress for teachers. These demands that I was describing are compounded and end up resulting in emotional exhaustion. You just get tired. And especially if you don't take care of yourself, which if you're like me, might have a hard time with that. So you end up emotionally exhausted, and when you're emotionally exhausted and stressed out, you tend to be reactive. You tend to respond to situations in ways that you might not really want to. You also perceive what's happening around you with some distortion. One of the things I saw while I was observing teachers, and I've seen this in myself, especially as a parent, that when we're really upset, when a student has done something that we really don't like, it's very easy to imagine that they're doing it intentionally on purpose to annoy us. You know, I mean, most of the time they're not. Most of the time they're just being kids. But what can happen is if this little kid over here drops his pencil or makes a funny face, and I immediately take it personally because I'm so stressed out because I gotta get through this lesson, and they're coming to visit me, and oh no, we haven't done blah blah, right? So he does something annoying, and well, if I respond to him with harshness at all, and he's not doing anything intentional, he's just being goofy or whatever, then I have interfered with my relationship with him, right? Now he doesn't feel safe, and he may just kind of freeze like I did, you know. He also may react in a way that's kind of normal, natural. Well, I didn't do anything wrong. Why are you picking on me? Right? You know, I'll show you. Well, then, you know, as the teacher is like, oh, see, I knew it. I knew it was intentional. And then you get these power struggles that create more chaos in the classroom. And after a while, you go, whoa, okay, none of us are calm. How can you learn when all of that's going on? So the first thing we have to do is support the teachers. We really have to give the teachers the support they need. Thank you. Another thing I have to say is it's natural to feel stressful in a space where you're told that you cannot leave. Okay, if I told you right now, nobody can leave this room, how do you feel? Okay, teachers cannot leave the room. Students can't leave the room either. I mean, technically they can, but not really. You can't even go take a break for the bathroom when you need to, when you're teaching. It's really, really stressful. Anyway, so in 2009, my friend and colleague Mark Greenberg and I published this paper that has now become incredibly highly cited, presenting this model. I mean, most of this model, the student outcomes at the end, the classroom climate, the teacher-student relationships, the classroom management, the social-emotional learning, all of that, there's plenty of research that supports all of those eras. What nobody had actually looked at was, what do teachers need to do all this? And when I discovered that, when I did this literature review, I went, oh my gosh, how could they have overlooked that? Such a really important part. So my colleagues and I decided, I was working with some other people, we decided, let's find a way to incorporate a mindfulness mindfulness-based approach to supporting teachers in this stressful context. And we created this program called Cultivating Awareness and Resilience in Education, or CARE. And we studied it, we've been studying it since 2008 in a variety of studies that have all been funded by the US Department of Education, which is really exciting that finally there's money behind this work. We developed this program, and it was pretty intense in the research we did because we were hoping that we would be, I'm going to show you this first, we were hoping that we'd be able to show improvements in the teacher's well-being, but also improve the classroom and show some positive student outcomes. Now that's a pretty tall order when all you're doing is giving the teacher something. You know, if you give the teachers this, will the kids be better? You're not teaching the teachers to teach differently at all. So we made the program pretty intensive. We felt like we needed to give them a pretty big dosage. So in the most recent study, we recruited 224 teachers in 36 elementary schools in the Bronx and Upper Manhattan in New York. And we chose these areas because we also hypothesized that the kids who would show most positive impacts from CARE would be those who were in most need, that were exposed to trauma, were living in hardship. So we chose places where there was a lot of hardship. And we randomized the teachers to get the CARE program or be in a waitlist control group. The program combines these elements, and it's all rooted in the teacher's own secular ethics. And what I mean by that is, a lot of you are educators. How many here got into education for the money? I didn't think so. We come to education because we have a deep commitment to helping others. We're very altruistic people. So we all want to do the right thing with our students. We all want to. So reminding ourselves that that's why we're doing this, reminding ourselves on a regular basis is a key part of this program, so that everything they're learning fits into this ethical framework that motivates them to do what they do every day. And it combines compassion practices, mindful awareness practices, and also some specific skills in emotion management, understanding emotions, recognizing emotions, and starting to see how those emotions and those feelings distort our perceptions. So, what's really exciting is that in this study, we did show that CARE had these cascading effects, is one of the ways I like to describe it. So the teachers in our study, after the program, the ones that were randomly assigned, their psychological distress was reduced significantly. Their emotion regulation was improved significantly. Their mindfulness was improved significantly. And this one kind of stress, you guys will all appreciate this, called time urgency, also improved. This is really interesting because when we did the qualitative research to better understand these results, we had teachers tell us, well, you know, when I calm myself down, I feel like I have more time. I don't feel so rushed. And I realize that when I get rushed, I waste time because I'm worrying about all the stuff I have to do and I'm not doing anything. So this time urgency seemed to be really important. So we also, this MBI says mindfulness-based intervention. So we saw improvements at the individual level. In the context, we observed these teachers' classrooms and we rated them using a standardized measure of classroom interaction quality. And the classrooms were more emotionally supportive significantly, which is really exciting. And when we drilled down, we saw the teachers were more sensitive to the needs of the students, and the classrooms were more emotionally positive. They were also more productive. So that was exciting in the context. But then we did show impacts on the students. They were more engaged, which, you know, if you've been an educator for a lot of years, it's kind of like, duh, right? But when you can show it in a randomized trial, people who hold the purse strings start to pay attention. So I was very thrilled with that. But now there were some really interesting moderating effects. So the students who were rated at the beginning as low in social skills, and they're likely the kids that were exposed to the most hardship, they improved in motivation and reading competence. So that makes me think that when the kids feel safer and the teachers are more engaged and sensitive, kids read better, which is really exciting. And finally, the teachers who were low on mindfulness at baseline, we called them the high-risk teachers, they improved in mindfulness, and their students also improved in reading too. So we're seeing here in this research some very important sort of downstream impacts of these mindfulness programs. So Valerie mentioned the Compassionate Schools Project. This is a project underway. It's currently in process. This curriculum will be freely available very, very soon. If you're interested in it, just go to if you Google Compassionate Schools Project, Louisville, Kentucky, UVA, you'll find our website. But we're doing this large trial, and hopefully we'll have some results soon to share with you all. And another project I'm very excited about, I just got a new grant to look at how CARE might improve the teacher's ability to deliver a social emotional learning program called PATHS and the student outcomes as a result. So when you combine CARE and PATHS, does that create some kind of catalytic effect that boosts the student outcomes? And so that's underway in the Chicago public schools right now. We just started it. And as Valerie mentioned, I have some books out that you can get outside. Mindfulness for Teachers really has the background of the CARE program in it. So if you're interested in CARE, a lot of the information that's in that training is in that book. I also have this new book, Trauma Sensitive Classroom, that came out recently too, about how we can support these trauma-exposed kids more specifically. So thank you, Valerie, for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I hope you all keep doing the great work you're doing, because it's really, really important. Thank you.
Thank you. So for those that don't know me, my name is Gus. For those that do know me, my name is Gus. And I just want to say thank you for all of you to be here tonight. Starting with our sponsors, this wouldn't have been possible without your help and your generosity. But also everybody else that's here, from way in the back there all the way up to the front here, because this is why we do these events and workshops and classes. It's a very personal privilege to be introducing these two gentlemen. So starting with our next speaker, Judge Steven Leifman. Judge Steve Leifman is an Associate Administrative Judge of the 11th Judicial Circuit of Florida. Beginning in 2010, Judge Leifman chaired the Florida Supreme Court Task Force on Substance Abuse and Mental Health in the Courts. He has been in the forefront of a national movement to decriminalize mental illness, and in the year 2000 started a program called the 11th Judicial Circuit Criminal Mental Health Project, which places defendants with mental health issues into community-based programs rather than prisons. So I think it's huge. Absolutely, thank you. Judge Leifman has worked with law enforcement on a program to recognize the signs and symptoms of mental illness and how and where to take those in crisis. These programs have diverted tens of thousands of people from prisons where they do not belong and have reduced recidivism and saved Florida taxpayers millions of dollars. Thank you. Judge Leifman's current project is the Mental Health Diversion Facility, a public-private mental health center planned to open in 2020. This facility is essential to the future of a program that offers valuable lessons about what is going right with mental health care reform today. Finally, Judge Leifman has been recognized in Florida and nationally for his work in mental health. In 2018, he was awarded the Hardest Humanitarian Prize in Mental Health by the Brain and Behavioral Research Foundation at Yale School of Medicine. The Hardest Prize is awarded to individuals, organizations that are making a profound and lasting impact in advancing the understanding of mental health and improving the lives of people living with mental illness. So it's really, really an honor and a privilege to be introducing Judge Leifman. Thank you.
Good evening.
Thank you, Gus. Thank you, Valerie, and thank you for the amazing contribution you are making to our community. And I want to thank all of you very much for being here this evening as well. You may be wondering, why is there a criminal court judge here talking about improving mental health through mindfulness-based programs? Well, the sad reality is that as a criminal court judge, I see more people with serious mental illnesses in a day than most psychiatrists probably see in a year. I think what you learn as a judge after serving for several years is that in many ways the criminal justice system is the repository for many failed public policies. And there is no greater failed public policy than our treatment towards people with serious mental illnesses. When I was 17 years old, I was an intern for a state senator, and he received a letter from the then editor of the Miami Herald about a young man who was at the local state hospital in Pembroke Pines. And the letter went on and said there was some concern about the treatment of this young man, that they weren't sure he needed to be there. Could the senator please check out this situation? Well, being the lowest person on the totem pole, I was selected to go to the hospital and check out the situation. You see, my age directly corresponds to the deinstitutionalization movement in this country. And when I got to the hospital, it was everything you saw in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. I found the young man. He was in all 4-point restraints. He was probably 100 pounds overweight from the Thorazine that they were injecting him with. He was moaning, he was crying, he was screaming. It was horrifying. I spoke to the staff, I pulled his records. This was way before HIPAA. And sadly, what I discovered was that he was not psychotic, he was autistic. And never should have been there to begin with. And while I was there, it turned out that there was a group of advocates that were there looking at the facility. And they heard there was a representative from a legislator's office, and they insisted that I take a tour of this facility, albeit a 17-year-old who knew nothing and had no power. But that moment changed my life as well. They took me downstairs to what I still remember looked like a dungeon, where I found 7 men lying naked in their own feces, while a guard stood there with a hose washing them down like they were animals in the zoo. The good news is we were able to get the young man out of the hospital, and he actually lived the best life he possibly could live given his condition. But it clearly left an indelible mark on me. 17 years later, I was appointed to the bench, and the same horrors that I had witnessed at that hospital, which was now closed, were going on in our jail, the Miami Dade County Jail, directly across the street from my courthouse. And so when I became a judge, I had no idea I was actually becoming the gatekeeper to the largest psychiatric facility in the state of Florida, the Miami Dade County Jail. And while the United States has 5% of the world's population, we have 25% of the world's inmates. Think about that. 1 out of every 4 inmates in the world is housed in the United States. And as we sit here this evening, 1 out of 104 adults are behind bars, and 1 out of 33 adults in the United States are under correctional supervision. Since 1980, the number of people going to jail in this country has tripled, and their sentences have increased by 166%. And as you drill down deeper to figure out what in the heck is going on, what you will find is most of this is due to untreated mental health and substance use disorders. In fact, people with mental illnesses in the United States are 10 times more likely to be incarcerated than hospitalized. They are 19 times more likely to find a bed in the criminal justice system than at any state civil hospital. Annually, each year in the United States, we have almost 2 million people with serious mental illnesses arrested, and on any given day, we have about 400,000 people with serious mental illnesses behind bars and another 800,000 under some type of correctional supervision. 40% of all people with serious mental illnesses in this country at some point will come into contact with the criminal justice system. This is a shameful American tragedy, and it's one that can and must be reversed. And it's so shameful because we know that treatment works. People with mental illnesses are no more dangerous than the general population, and on medication, they're much less dangerous than the general population. And the good news is that recovery rates for this population are actually better than for people with heart disease and diabetes. And if you're not offended enough by what we have done, you should be offended by our cost of treating these issues as crimes instead of illnesses. Last year in the United States, the counties collectively spent over $80 billion on correctional costs, and the state spent an additional $70 billion in prisons. So my journey into the criminal justice mental health world actually began one morning when I was getting ready to go on the bench. I was approached by the assistant public defender and the assistant state attorney, and they asked me if I would speak to a couple whose son was in jail on a case I was about to hear. At the time, I was handling what we call a misdemeanor jail division. These are people that are charged with very low-level offenses that are still in custody. And there's three kinds of people you will find in that division. You will find those that have attached serious crimes that aren't allowed out of jail. You'll find those that are too poor and they cannot afford a bond out of jail. But mostly what you find are people with serious mental illnesses that don't know how to get out of jail. And so the lawyers came back and they said, Judge, you need to speak to this couple. Their son is in a case that you're about to hear, and it's really a startling, remarkable story, and I think you should speak to them. So this lovely couple came into my chambers. They were very, very sophisticated, and they were incredibly distraught. The mom was crying, the dad was shaking, and they literally began to beg me to get their son help. They told me that he was brilliant, he had gone to Harvard, he had a late onset of schizophrenia, and he was now homeless and recycling through the criminal justice system, and they just didn't know what to do. And I was pretty new at the time. This is in 2000, and I think when you're a new judge, you think you have a lot more wisdom and a lot more power than you do. And I made one of the biggest mistakes in my career. I promised them that I would get their son help because I deal in logic. And I knew that if someone got arrested and had a heart attack, we had a healthcare system that would clearly take care of them. And I just assumed the same must be true for people with mental illnesses because you see, at that time in Florida, judges had absolutely no training on how to identify or deal with people with serious mental illnesses. And I just assumed. Well, as I started to go back into the courtroom, the mom stopped me and she said, Judge, there's one more thing I need to tell you. She said, respectfully, my son probably knows more about the mental health system than you do. And I was confused. I wasn't sure what she was trying to tell me. And I said, excuse me? And she said, well, you see, my son is the former head of psychiatry at Jackson Memorial Hospital. Which was my reaction. I was pretty taken back. I went into the courtroom. I called his case. And we started to have an amazing conversation. Now, mind you, I don't remember the exact charge, but I don't even think it was a statutory offense. It was one of those little county ordinances that counties around the country often use to sweep people that are homeless up. And I think his charge was something like possession of a dairy cart, punishable by 60 days in jail. We get a lot of homeless people picked up on those charges. So we were talking and we were having an amazing conversation. He was coherent. He was thoughtful. He was more respectful than the lawyers. And I'm thinking, hey, maybe there's something wrong with the folks, but the guy seems really good to me. Except when you looked at him, he looked like a homeless man that hadn't bathed in months. And he kept insisting there was absolutely nothing wrong with him. And he said, Judge, look, I didn't commit this crime. And even if I did, nobody goes to jail for this, and there's really dangerous people. You need my bed. This is ridiculous. I have no type of mental health disorder. If you release me, I'll go get evaluated, I'll see a psychiatrist, and I'll come back. I said, can I ask you a question? He said, yes, Your Honor, anything. I said, I just don't understand one thing. You keep insisting there's absolutely nothing wrong with you. But if that's the case, why would a Harvard-educated psychiatrist be in jail, be homeless, and recycling through the criminal justice system? And all of a sudden, he got a look on his face that I will not forget to the day I die. It was a look that I can only describe to you that someone has right before they think they're going to die. It was a look of complete terror and fear. And all of a sudden, he started shaking back and forth, and he started cupping his ears, and he went into a full-blown psychotic episode, and he started screaming at the top of his lungs. He started pointing to the back of the courtroom where his parents were, and everything he yelled was in sixes. And he started yelling, Your Honor, Your Honor, Your Honor, you have to have that couple removed. You have to have that couple removed. I said to him, aren't those your parents? No, 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 no. My real parents, died. Holocaust, 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 Holocaust. And they're from the CIA, and they came to kill me, kill me, kill me, kill me, kill me. The only thing that I have been taught, which wasn't much, is that if someone acted strange or bizarre, order a psychological evaluation. I wasn't even sure what I was supposed to do after the evaluation came back. Well, meanwhile, he's now in jail 3-4 weeks on possession of a dairy cart. Evaluation finally came back and said not only was he incompetent to stand trial, but he even met Florida's ridiculously high standard for involuntary commitment, and he needed to be hospitalized immediately. And I'm thinking, this is great. I'm going to fulfill the promise I made his parents. I'm going to get this guy help. I'll be a hero. I'm never going to have to deal with mental health again. But at the time, and you know where this is going, this is in 2000. At the time, I needed 3 evaluations to get the lawyers to agree or stipulate. I ordered 2 more evaluations. Now he's in jail on possession of a dairy cart, 9, 10, 12 weeks. All 3 evaluations come back and they say the exact same thing. They say he's incompetent and he meets criteria for involuntary commitment. I'm like, this is great. I hand the evaluations to the lawyers. They immediately agree that he's incompetent to stand trial. I begin to order him into involuntary commitment. And I look down and I notice the assistant public defender has a grin on her face. Now, I will tell you, as a former assistant public defender, it's a really bad sign. I don't know if, do I have any lawyers in the room? All right, I got a couple. So they're going to appreciate this next line more than the rest of you, but it's pretty obvious. She said, Your Honor, in all due respect. You see, when a lawyer says that to a judge, it has nothing to do with respect. That's how they tell us we're clueless and we don't know what we're doing. And I said, excuse me, and she whips out this Florida Supreme Court opinion that had literally came out of Broward 2 months earlier. And what did it say? It said that county court judges have absolutely no authority to involuntarily commit anybody, and the only thing I could do was release this man back to the street, floridly psychotic. None of us go into our professions to be part of that kind of problem. Not only did I not fulfill the promise I made his parents, I released this floridly psychotic man back to the street. I put him at risk, put the community at risk. I probably put my job at risk. God forbid something terrible happened to him or he did something terrible to someone else, but I followed the law. I went back to my chambers, I got on the phone, I was determined never to be in that position again, and I learned 3 very valuable lessons that morning. One is I learned that we had a very serious mental health crisis in our community. In Florida, unfortunately, is 49th or 50th per capita in mental health funding, and only about 1% of our population get access to the public mental health system in our community. And as a result, our jail had become the largest psychiatric facility in Florida. 35% of our inmates were on antipsychotic medication. 57% of our inmates are classified as having some mental health treatment need. 50% of our children arrested in our community have at least one mental health disorder, most of it related to trauma. And even equally, I should say, disgusting, we spend $636,000 a day That's $232 million a year to warehouse people in conditions that you wouldn't allow your dog to stay in. And until recently, 3.5 of our 9 floors at the main jail were mental health floors, and because conditions are not conducive for treatment in jail, people with mental illnesses stay 4 to 8 times longer than someone without a mental illness for the exact same charge at 7 times the cost. And even worse, because we had done such a terrible job training our law enforcement how to deal with this crisis, we had more than 25 people with mental illnesses die during an encounter with the police because they weren't appropriately trained. That was the first lesson. The second lesson I learned is this was not just a local problem, but it turned out to be a state and national crisis as well. And the third lesson, the more difficult lesson I learned that day, is our community mental health system, our crisis system, and our laws are antiquated, fragmented, do not reflect modern science and medical research and practices, and need to be reformed. I've been doing this almost 20 years, and I've come to a very simple conclusion. If we treated people with primary health issues the way we treated people with mental illnesses, not only would there be this plethora of civil lawsuits, there would probably be indictments for gross negligence. What other illness is it okay to discharge people in the middle of the night, floridly psychotic, and then when they don't behave the way society needs them to behave, we arrest them? And I don't know why we're not angrier about it, because we don't have to accept it. Treatment works. People recover. They don't have to be treated like dogs in a jail. So through deinstitutionalization, the war on drugs, the war on crime, sentencing guidelines, massive housing cuts in the 80s, it created this perfect storm. In 1955, there were some 560,000 people in state hospitals around the United States. If nothing had changed, and I'm not advocating this, we don't need all these hospital beds, but I want to make a point. If nothing had changed, we'd have about 1.5 million people in state hospitals around the country. I'm not advocating that. Except today we have less than 30,000 hospital beds. And last year, almost 1.5 million people were arrested in 2 million incidents having very serious mental illnesses. So we never deinstitutionalized. What we did is we transferred responsibilities from these really horrible, crappy hospitals to these really horrible, crappy jails. But in some ways, we've made it worse. Because now, not only do they have to deal with the stigma of having a serious mental illness, now they have to deal with being a criminal with serious mental illness. And once you get a record in this country, it's impossible to get housing, it's impossible to get employment. You end up hanging around real criminals, learning real crime, and you end up recycling through a criminal justice system your entire adult life. And the second and maybe sadder irony here is that we have come full circle, because when this country was first founded, we used to jail people with mental illnesses, and that's what we are doing today. And with all the advances we have made in this country in civil rights, it's the one area we have lost ground and gone backwards on. We've seen homelessness increase, we've seen police injuries increase, we've seen police shootings of people with mental illnesses increase, we've wasted critical tax dollars. And in many ways, we've made mental illness a crime in this country. In Florida, our police actually initiate more involuntary examinations under the Baker Act than the total number of arrests that they make for robbery, burglary, and grand theft auto combined. And if this wasn't disturbing enough, let's talk about the fiscal impact. So when we began to do our project in Miami, we wanted to see if we could get our arms around the people that were penetrating the system the most so we could get the better outcomes. We're very fortunate at the University of South Florida. They have something called the Florida Mental Health Institute, and they're one of the only institutions in the U.S. that have these blended data sets that can actually tell a community who the highest utilizers of criminal justice and mental health services are. And so we sent them the names of 3,300 people that had already come through our system, that had been arrested, that we identified as having serious mental illnesses. And so they have access to all the Baker Act records, all the arrest records, all the Medicaid and Medicare records. So I crunched all the numbers and I thought, hey, maybe they'll narrow it to 1,000 people. That's not a bad start. But at least we'll get a better idea who's coming in and who we need to give better services to. Well, to my shock and amazement, I got a letter in the mail, not even an email. It was a thin letter. I open it up and it's one piece of paper. And on this one piece of paper are the names of 97 people. Primarily men, primarily diagnosed with schizoaffective or schizophrenia, primarily homeless, primarily co-occurring, who over a 5-year period, these 97 people were arrested 2,200 times. They spent 27,000 days in the Dade County Jail. They spent 13,000 days at a psychiatric facility in South Florida and cost taxpayers $14.7 million, and we got nothing for it. The reality is we would have been better off sending them to Harvard. They would have had an education, housing, they would have been treated humanely, and they would have done much better than what we did for them. But the good news of that story is we don't have to fix the whole system. We just have to be smarter and start targeting the people with the greater acuity and move upstream, which I'm going to talk about in a minute because that's where mindfulness plays such an important role. But if this wasn't bad enough, let's talk about our prisons real quick in Florida. While most states are seeing a leveling out of its prison growth, including Florida, over the last 12 years, we've seen about a 53% increase in the number of people going to prison in Florida. During that same period of time, we've seen a 170% increase in the number of people with mental illnesses going to prison. And maybe if they were committing horrible, heinous offenses, it would be okay, but the average stay for someone going to prison with a mental illness in Florida is only 2.5 to 4 years. They're going because of sentencing guidelines and picking up a bunch of quality of life offenses and ending up in prison on third-degree felonies. It's growing so fast right now that if Florida doesn't change its trajectory, we're going to have to build 10 new prisons over the next 10 years just to house its mental health population. The cost to build and operate 10 new prisons over 10 years in Florida is over $2 billion. So they can sit 2.5 to 4 years and come back to the same under-resourced, inadequate system of care that got them there to begin with. There is clearly something wrong with a society that's willing to spend more money to incarcerate people who are ill than to treat them. So how do we fix it? Well, after this terrible situation we had with the psychiatrist in 2000, fortuitously, the first national meeting of its kind was in Miami. And I went, it was like a religious experience. For the first time, I heard people talking about solutions. I begged them for a grant, which they gave us. They brought in 3 national experts. I think the best thing about being a judge is when you invite people to a meeting, they come even if they don't want to be there. So be careful if I call you. And I invited all the traditional and non-traditional stakeholders that I needed to make structural change in our community. The state attorney, the public defender, other judges, providers, the Department of Children and Families, you name it, we had them there. In the first half day, what we did is we literally mapped out how the criminal justice system intersected with the community mental health system. And what we found is it did not, that we were embarrassingly dysfunctional. And I remember going around, we had the police director, which is our equivalent to a sheriff, police chiefs, and we all looked at each other and we said, who's more sick? Us so-called policy people that designed and developed a system designed to fail. Or these poor souls who just have illnesses and are not getting the opportunity to recover. And as a result, we created a 2-part approach. And I will tell you, if I had the opportunity to do it again, I would create a 3-part approach. The 2-part approach we created was a pre- and post-arrest system. We looked around the country. We saw that there was a wonderful program out of Memphis called Crisis Intervention Team Policing. It's a police 40-hour training program that teaches our law enforcement officers how to identify someone who's in a mental health crisis, how to de-escalate so no one got shot, and where to take them as opposed to arresting them. It wasn't easy. The last thing they wanted was some civilian judge to tell them how to do their jobs. With the assistance of our state attorney, Kathy Fernandez-Rundle, and a grand jury report, we started to change minds, and we started to change hearts. We went from having all this resistance to getting law enforcement trained to having the largest trained squad of police officers in the country. We have about 7,300 officers trained. All 36 departments in Miami-Dade are trained, and I have to tell you, it is remarkable. When we started the program, we had about 118,000 arrests in Dade County a year. About 25 to 30% of them were people with mental illnesses. The number of arrests in Dade County this year fell to 53,000. And I will tell you, the police deserve amazing credit. We keep data on every single call the City of Miami, Miami-Dade County Police make on these what we call CIT, Crisis Intervention Team calls. Over the last 8 years, they handled 91,472,000 mental health calls. They only made 152 arrests and shot and killed no one during those calls. But we learned something startling during our training. The police are in great need of treatment. I'm not being sarcastic. As it turns out, the woman that trains my law enforcement officers gets 150 calls a month from them for their own personal mental health issues. You see, trauma is not emotional, it's physiological. You have this little thing in your body, and my great doctor, Dr. Zimmerman, is here, so he'll back me up. You have this little thing in your body called the pituitary gland. It's part of your warning system. When you're exposed to trauma, what happens is your pituitary sends a little message to your adrenaline. Your adrenaline releases a chemical called cortisol, and it's your flight or fight mechanism. And it tells you to get out of the way. And if you're a law enforcement officer, you're not allowed to leave the trauma. And there was a study last year that said police officers get 6 to 9 times more cortisol a day than we do. They suffer from severe PTSD. And while shootings certainly may reflect race issues, they also are reflecting really bad PTSD, and they have trauma, and they're overreacting. And so they won't go to their departments for help. So one of the things that we had to do is we get them treated now outside the department, which they love. The number of shootings went from 2 a month in Dade County to 5 or 6 in the last 8 years. Last year, more officers in the United States committed suicide than died in the line of duty. They have high domestic violence rates, substance abuse rates, and divorce rates because they suffer from such trauma. We also set up a post-arrest diversion program. So now if you come into the Dade County Jail, you're immediately screened at the jail. We set up new assessment tools. And if there's an indication you have a serious mental illness, you're screened by a psychiatrist that day. And if you meet criteria on a misdemeanor, like that psychiatrist did, while I don't have the authority to involuntarily commit, the psychiatrist does. And so if they meet criteria within 3 days, we get them out. We send them to a crisis stabilization unit because they're on a criminal hold. The 72 hours of the Baker Act doesn't apply. They need a couple weeks. We get them stable, and as they begin to stabilize, members of our team go and see them, and we encourage them to take our program. And if they agree to take our program, which most of them do, they don't get rebooked. They get taken directly to court. And when they get to court, one of my 8 peer specialists are waiting for them. Those are people with mental illnesses in recovery. 4 of them graduated from our program. And when they get to court, and they are the secret sauce of our recipe, there's no doubt about it, because they help reestablish relationships which most of this population has lost. And when they get to court, they have food, they have clothes, they have housing, we get their benefits lined up, the county gave us a car to transport them, and we start to get them in recovery. And guess what happened? The recidivism rate among our misdemeanor population dropped from 72% to 20%. The program worked so well that we were able to expand it to nonviolent felony cases. That program has been in effect for about 7 years. Recidivism dropped to about 25%, saving the county so far 84 years of jail bed days. It's worked so well that the county closed one of its 3 main jails. And that's when you get real savings. And for us, it's $12 million a year. It's now been closed 7 years. It's almost $84 million in actual savings to the county. But I said if I was going to do this again, I would have started with a third approach. I would have had the school board and the superintendent and the pediatricians at the program. And it's because we have real data to tell us why. This is one of the worst statistics you will ever hear. 92% of all women in jails and prisons in the United States with serious mental illnesses were sexually abused as children. 75% of men in jail and prisons with serious mental illnesses also have very serious trauma histories. Some of it's sexual abuse, a lot of it is domestic violence, or some of it is living in a war zone and seeing stuff a kid should never have to see. And a young brain that's exposed to too much cortisol is damaged even more than an older brain. And so what happens is they act out at school. Do we wrap our arms around them and ask them, is something going on? What can I do to help? No, we immediately punish the behavior, often re-traumatizing and making things worse. And so I believe every pediatrician should be checking for trauma. I would like to see our schools at some point start using ACEs to identify kids that are showing signs and symptoms that have serious trauma backgrounds and making sure that they're getting treatment and mindfulness programming. Because it works. There was a study out, and it was alluded to earlier by the superintendent, and thank you for what you do, that said that our young people today are suffering from greater anxiety than during the Great Depression and World War II. We have some very serious issues on our hands that we have to address, and this is probably one of the best ways to do it. Now, we've been very successful in our programs, but there's still about 20% of our population that we've not been able to help because they're too sick. There's so much new science out there now that shows us that for people with very serious mental illnesses that go with psychosis without treatment for too long of a period get permanent brain damage. And so the people that are left in our jail at this point are very, very sick, and we have no capacity in the community for them. The traditional community system's not effective enough for them. So because of the amazing collaboration, and we're very fortunate to live in our community. I know we hear a lot of bad stuff, but let me tell you something. We're the only county in the United States that stepped up that has absolutely no legal responsibility for mental health. And the county, between the county and Jackson Memorial Hospital, has given us $42.1 million, and we are now in the middle of construction that was mentioned by Gus. We are now building the first of its kind mental health diversion facility called the Miami Center for Mental Health and Recovery. It'll be a medical home. It'll have a receiving facility, but it's not for the people that can be served by the existing system. It's for the most acutely ill that keep recycling through hospitalization and jail. And when they come in, there'll be a crisis stabilization unit. There'll be a short-term residential facility. There'll be a primary health clinic, a dental clinic, an eye clinic, a tattoo removal. You'd be amazed what people in psychosis do with tattoos. It's really hard to get a job when it says hell on your forehead. Or the guy last week that had a marijuana plant on his face. It will have a courtroom so that we can monitor criminally and civilly. It will have trauma services, and it will have a mindfulness program to help people keep their stress levels down. It will have a culinary supportive employment program so that instead of just discharging people to the street after we've adjudicated their case and expect them to recover, we could gently, slowly send them back to the community with all the supports that they need for recovery. It also will have 200 beds of housing. People can live there up to a year before they need to go back to the community. And I am sure that once we finally do this, that we will finally develop the system that we were supposed to develop when we deinstitutionalized. And we will start to treat people the way they needed to be treated. You know, look, these shortcomings of our community mental health system, our criminal justice and juvenile systems, they did not happen overnight. And they didn't happen over any one person or one party's fault. This is a perfect, bizarre storm that has occurred, and not one person or one party is going to fix it. The kind of collaboration we've seen in Miami-Dade is what it takes to fix it. And I am convinced that once we do this, we will truly revolutionize our criminal justice system and allow these individuals with these serious mental illnesses the opportunity for recovery and hope. Thank you all very, very much.
Powerful talk so far, thanks. And now we have the last but not least of the talk. So And for me, I don't want to make this about me or anything, but this is a real honor and a real pleasure to introduce our next speaker because of what he does and my background and what I do too. So, but I'll jump right in and just introduce him, and can't wait to hear his talk. So it's Dr. Judson Brewer, M.D., Ph.D. is an internationally known thought leader in the field of habit change and the science of self-mastery, having 12 plus years of experience with mindfulness training and scientific research. He is currently the Director of Research and Innovation at Brown University's Mindfulness Center and an Associate Professor of Psychiatry at the Brown Medical School. He's also a research affiliate at MIT. And before coming to Brown last year, he was the Director of Research and Interim Director at UMass. The University of Massachusetts Center for Mindfulness, where a lot of these programs that we're all involved with came from. And prior to that, he was at Yale, Department of Psychiatry at the Yale Medical School. As an addiction psychiatrist and internationally known expert in mindfulness training for treating addictions, Dr. Brewer's current research interests include the intersection between mindfulness, emotional regulation, and behavioral change. He has developed novel mindfulness programs for behavioral change, including treatments for smoking, emotional eating, and anxiety. Additionally, his work bridges basic and clinical sciences through translational research that includes designs, testing, and implementation of digital therapeutics in the real-world settings, aka apps. He has published numerous peer-reviewed articles and book chapters, and his work has been featured on 60 Minutes, Time Magazine, Forbes, BBC, NPR, Business Week, and many others. And his 2016 TED Talk was the 4th most viewed TED Talk that year. I just checked earlier today, it's up to almost 14 million views so far. And I can attest that I've watched it 10 times or so. Proud to be one of those 14 millions. He's the author of The Craving Mind, From Cigarettes to Smartphone to Love, Why We Get Hooked and How We Can Break Bad Habits. And then finally, he's very passionate about understanding how our brains work and how to use that knowledge to help people make deep and permanent changes in their lives, with the goal of reducing suffering in the world at large. So I'm very, very grateful to be able to introduce and listen to him tonight again. I haven't seen him just a couple years ago, but thanks for coming back, Judd. Appreciate it.
I have to say it's really hard to follow these previous talks, and just as a psychiatrist, just listening to some of Judge Leifman's statistics, they're still just sitting in my gut. It's yes, and it's really heartening to hear what you all are doing here, really pioneering that. It's just so needed. The other thing I want to state is that as a white heterosexual male, I come with a particular perspective in blinding, where I might not see things in the way that others do, and I just want to state that so that it's out there, because I think that's really important. So why don't we get started? What I thought we could do is really, these are my financial disclosures for the purpose of Brown University, you can read those. I thought I'd start with a patient that I started seeing in my clinic about 6 months ago. He was referred to me for anxiety, and when he walked in the door, I could instantly see that that was a correct diagnosis. He was literally shaking. And when we started to get into his history a bit, it turns out that he had severe panic. He met all the criteria for panic disorder. And in fact, was terrified of driving on the highway because he felt like he would get into a car accident. And he was so terrified that he was basically limiting himself to his house. And so just driving the few miles from his home to my clinic, not even on the highway, was really nerve-wracking for him. The other thing that was pretty obvious about him was that he was about 180 pounds overweight. And so was hypertensive, had a fatty liver, had a lot of physical issues that he was struggling with as well. So what did I learn in medical school and in residency training? about treating these things? Well, with anxiety, we have medications that don't work as well as we'd like. We have medications like benzodiazepines that have an addiction to potential, and also the recommendation is to only use them for short-term anxiety, 2 to 4 weeks. How about with obesity? I literally learned a formula, calories in versus calories out. Make sure you have more calories out than in, and you'll lose weight, which is a correct formula. But I'm not sure when my medical school professors had last been in the clinic that were teaching that formula. Here's an example of how well we're doing with the obesity epidemic in the United States. Haines Purple is not good. And we've seen about the same things happen with other epidemics, like the opioid epidemic, really blossomed over the last 15 years. Now, just I can even relate to this personally. So what do we learn to just grit our teeth and to white knuckle it and to eat salad instead of cake? We're trying to quit smoking. Just set a quit date for 2 weeks out. As a physician, I can give you some medication that might help with the physical withdrawal, and then magically you're supposed to quit smoking. From a personal perspective, when I started meditating, I was going to use the same thing. I just, pay attention to my breath. Seemed like a pretty easy instruction. Yet when I went on my first week-long silent meditation retreat, by day 3, I was crying uncontrollably on the shoulder of the retreat manager. I'd made it through college, through medical school, into medical school, and yet I couldn't pay attention to something as simple as my breath. The problem here, for me and for our system, was that we were trying to solve a problem with the same consciousness that created it. We were trying to use willpower, or grit, as some people describe it. And this relies on a part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex, which, ironically, is the youngest part of the brain and the first that goes offline when we get stressed. So what can we do instead? What I would suggest is there might actually be a solution that's right in front of our noses that we haven't paid attention to, that we can actually utilize. And this starts with understanding how our minds work. There's a guy, some of you might recognize him, his pigeons might give it away, named B.F. Skinner, who was very interested in understanding animal behavior. In fact, if you can roll this video, he studied pigeons, and he found that he could teach a pigeon to win a cross-court shot in ping pong for a food reward. There it is. That was the reward. In fact, he came up with a theory, called it operant conditioning, or positive and negative reinforcement. Eric Kandel ended up winning the Nobel Prize, showing that this is evolutionarily conserved all the way back to the sea slug. So a very, very well-developed theory. There's the instant replay. So how far have we come with taking what we've learned? This is back in the 50s about our minds in science. If you could play this next video. This is a Weight Watchers commercial.
If you're happy and you know it, eat a snack. If you're happy and you know it, eat a snack. If you're happy and you know it, then your face will surely show it. If you're happy and you know it, eat a snack. If you're sad and you know it, eat a snack. If you're sad and you know it, eat a snack. If you're sad because you're angry, feeling down, or generally bad, if you're sad, eat a snack. If you're bored and you know it, eat a snack. If you're lonely and you know it, eat a snack. If you're sleepy and you know it, if you're guilty and you know it, if you're stressed, eat a snack. If you're human and you know it, then your face will surely show it. If you're human, eat your feelings, eat a snack.
No kidding. How many of you have seen this commercial? One person, yes. So I met the current CEO of Weight Watchers, now called WW International, at a conference earlier this year, and I said, this is amazing. This is an amazing commercial. A friend had sent this to me. She found it on YouTube. And I said, why don't we see this on television? And she said, oh, it almost bankrupted the company. I talked to another one of their executives, and she said, oh yeah, it makes people depressed. But what they're pointing out is this very basic thing, and I think they do it in a beautifully pithy way. You know, this is how we learn stuff, and they're just using food as an example. Now, if we want to look at this from a stuffy scientific perspective, what we're talking about is what Skinner and others had been discovering. That, you know, if we do some behavior and it feels good, we want that good feeling to continue. If we do something bad, our brain says this feels bad, make it go away. And so we have this urge to make it go away. And then we do some behavior. I'm using smoking and eating here as examples. And then we lay down this memory that says, oh, remember what you did. And we form this positive or negatively associated memory. Now I'm showing you some studies that have dated back to the 1800s. It actually turns out that the ancient Buddhist psychologists had described this 2,500 years ago before paper was even invented. So as a scientist, it's really helpful to understand mechanism because then I can study things. I can pick mechanistic pathways, develop hypotheses, and test to see if they're actually true. As a clinician, it's also very helpful to understand this because then I can really put myself in my patient's shoes and understand what they're struggling with. For example, my patients with alcohol use disorder, there's this saying, people, places, and things. If you avoid people, places, and things, you're less likely to drink, to which they say, duh. But we can see how this works mechanistically. My patients who are trying to quit smoking, it's a little harder to avoid all the places that they smoke, so there are other strategies such as substitutions. Eat candy instead of smoking, which of course leads to the average 15-pound weight gain when somebody quits smoking. The problem is that neither of these actually dismantle this core addictive loop. You can see it's still intact. If we boil this down to three basic elements, so this is something you can take home with you this evening, is that this pathway was actually set up to help us survive. We see food, we eat that food, and our stomach sends this dopamine signal to our brain that says, remember what you ate and where you found it. So it's actually set up to help us remember where food is. We use the same process to avoid danger. You see the proverbial saber-toothed tiger, you run away, and your reward is that you get to live. To avoid that place in the future. So we can see how this is set up. Now, from a mechanistic perspective, information is really powerful. The food industry knows this, right? And so they can design stuff to be food-like, so we'll eat it. And I like how the New York Times used the Dorito as their cover art. It's my favorite peer-reviewed journal, The Onion. They had a headline that says, Dorito celebrates its 1 millionth ingredient. This is not food. The tech industry has taken this up, where social media platforms are designed for the likes and the retweets. So, you know, the bottom line is we do know how our minds work, and these are being used in various ways. You can see in the food industry and in the tech industry. Here's my summary slide of this piece. So I know, poor Cookie Monster. So if we do know so much about how our minds work, why aren't we actually working with them? So this is where my work at the Mindfulness Center comes in. I'm sure I don't need to tell this audience the definition of mindfulness, but this is one that John Kabat-Zinn has put forward, paying attention in the present moment on purpose, non-judgmentally. And we can think about this mechanistically as bringing awareness to what's happening and notice that push and pull, that push of the, oh, that's unpleasant, go away, that pull of, ooh, that's really good, let's keep that going a little bit longer. To the point where we become these, we habitually react. As soon as there's a trigger that pops up, we already have a cigarette in our mouth, or we've already got food in our mouth, or or we're already moving, toward our phone. What mindfulness helps us do is drive this wedge of awareness in so that instead of habitually reacting, we can respond skillfully. We can bring that awareness in to have that space to respond. Now that's the theory. Is this actually true scientifically? So I'll give you a brief overview of some of the studies that we've done. We've done work with alcohol and cocaine use disorder and found that mindfulness training is as good as gold standard treatment, in this case cognitive behavioral therapy, at preventing relapse. We moved on to doing work with smoking cessation. And I'll never forget this guy that came in who had been smoking 40 years. And so if we just calculated the number of times that he had reinforced that habit loop, roughly 293,000 times. So he was really working against a lot of conditioning. And of course, had tried everything conventional and had failed, which is why he'd come to us. In our first study, which was this randomized controlled trial, where people were randomized to get cognitive therapy or mindfulness training, they didn't know what treatment they were going to get. We needed to blind them so that they wouldn't be biased coming in. And the people randomized to mindfulness training, we gave them the homework to smoke. And they looked at us like, is this the experiment? But there was a specific condition that we gave them. We said, no, smoke, but pay attention as you smoke and see what happens. Which actually gets to this question of, is awareness actually enough? Is this enough to help us work with our minds? Does this actually help us change behavior? What did people start noticing? This is somebody who reported doing mindful smoking exercise, smells like stinky cheese and tastes like chemicals. Yuck. Now this is really critical because instead of brute forcing it and saying, I'm just going to quit, which hadn't worked for these folks previously, otherwise they wouldn't be in our studies, we were actually tapping into this reward-based learning process. Now reward-based learning isn't based on behavior. If it were, the just quit would work. It's really based on rewards. That's how our brains are set up. If a behavior is rewarding, we will do it again. So it's not actually the behavior that's as critical as the reward. And what we could help people do is see just how unrewarding smoking was. They could move from the reward of being 13 and rebelling against their parents or whatever it was that induced their smoking in the first place. And our average age of onset for folks in our studies was 13 and still is for the person that started smoking. They could move from that to current day value. That reward value was not good. When they tasted the cigarette, it didn't taste good. When they smelled the cigarette, it didn't smell good. And this helped people tap into a more intrinsic process, their reward-based learning system, rather than using their prefrontal cortex to try to force themselves not to smoke or to think, oh, I might get cancer in the future. Or as Yogi Berra put it, you can observe a lot just by watching. In fact, we observed in our study that we get 5 times the quit rates of gold standard treatment. And we could actually work out the mechanisms. I don't have time to go into that this evening, but I'm happy to share some of the papers we've published around this. And what this suggests is that we can actually bring this wedge of awareness in and decouple craving and the behavior itself. Now, interestingly, as we were doing this work, I was working at the VA hospital. We were on a smoke-free campus. And I'd look out my window and see my patients out in the parking lot with the cigarette in one hand and what they have in their other hand, their weapon of mass distraction. And I had this aha moment where I realized, wait a minute, these behaviors are set up in context. They're setting up context-dependent memory. So treating them in my office is actually artificial. They don't learn to smoke in my office. They don't learn to overeat in my office. So could I actually package my office and bring it to them? So this is back in 2010, 2011, when the iPhone was starting to roll out, and we started asking this question: could we actually package evidence-based treatment and deliver it to people where they needed it, right in their context? So we started developing apps around smoking, around emotional eating, and even around anxiety. And the idea is that we can give people bite-sized pieces of mindfulness training. Right? 10 minutes a day instead of having to get childcare or get out of work early or whatever to come to a long training session. We could embed animations to make these programs accessible and easy to understand. We could importantly embed in-the-moment exercises. So right in the moment that they had an urge to smoke or to eat or were anxious, they could actually work with it. And also, we can embed experience sampling. So we can actually do some science around this and see if these things work. And importantly, we can also pair these with online communities because as we're hearing, community support is really, really critical. And it is very critical for addiction treatment and any type of behavior change. So I'll just briefly mention a patient that I saw in my clinic who was referred to me for binge eating disorder. And in fact, perhaps not surprising given some of the statistics that we've heard this evening, she had a significant trauma history. Both of her parents had survived the Khmer Rouge genocide and had immigrated to the United States. And her mom had probably started taking out some of her trauma on my patient when she was about 8 years of age. By the time she came to see me, she was 30 and very, very overweight. And what she described was that she would eat entire large pizzas in one sitting, 20 out of 30 days a month, as a way to numb herself from negative emotions. She'd started learning this at the age of 8, and had reinforced it over the preceding, or the following 22 years. Mechanistically, we can see what was happening. She had negative emotions, she would binge, and she would get this brief relief. Ironically, she would often feel bad about her binges. She didn't like her body image. She didn't like that she had no control over this. And that negative emotion would trigger another binge because that's all her brain knew how to do. And so she would often binge multiple times a day. Long story short, she didn't know how her mind worked. And so she was one of the folks that inspired us to start looking to see if we could actually develop trainings to help people work with this basic learning process. We don't have to smoke to survive, but we do have to eat to survive. So could we use these same trainings to help people work with eating that had become uncontrollable and return to normal eating behaviors? Long story short, led by a study at UCSF by Ashley Mason, we found that we could get a 40% reduction in craving-related eating in just a few months using an app-based mindfulness training program. And importantly, you can see this gets right at the heart of these negative emotional processes. We saw a 35% reduction in eating to cope with these negative emotions. So this was nice to see. We could see mindfulness decoupling craving and smoking. We could also see it decouple craving and eating. So we then started looking at another epidemic, which is physician burnout. And I won't go into all the details about why physicians and clinicians, and this extends actually to the helping professions, including educators. There's severe burnout because of all sorts of systematic things I don't have time to go into. And so we did a study. We developed a program called Unrunning Anxiety, did a study to see if we could help anxious physicians, and lo and behold, we got a 57% reduction in anxiety, in clinically validated anxiety scores. We used the Generalized Anxiety Disorder 7 scale. If this were a pill, we'd be gazillionaires, because medications just don't work this well. This was a small pilot study, only 34 physicians, and unfortunately the easiest study I ever recruited for. It took one email from the CEO of our healthcare system to recruit all the folks that we needed for this. So folks in severe need, but encouraging that they would use a program like this and that we could see results. Now, gold standard in medical science is randomized controlled trials. So we did an NIH-funded study that we literally just got the results for 2 weeks ago, with people with generalized anxiety disorder, because there is a severe shortage of psychiatrists in the country, and it's very few people that have anxiety actually get treatment, part of it for a number of systematic reasons. So long story short, we did this randomized controlled trial and found that we could get a similar magnitude of reduction in anxiety in as few as 2 months with people with generalized anxiety disorder. And I want to highlight a number here. So in medical science, to make things simple to understand and quick, we have this metric that's called number needed to treat, which basically means how many people do you need to give the drug or treatment to see a result in one person. With medications, with antidepressants, which are the gold standard for anxiety, Number needed to treat is 5.15. So you have to treat 5 people risking side effects, et cetera. And I'm a psychiatrist. I prescribe these things. I'm not saying they're not helpful. I'm just saying they're not good enough. With mindfulness training, we can get a number needed to treat down to 1.6 with very, very few side effects. So what I would suggest is we actually know a whole lot about how the mind works. And by knowing that, we can actually tap into these basic mechanisms, seeing pretty significant and clinically relevant results. Now, I want to jump right into some of the neural mechanisms we've been studying because I know it's already late this evening, and so I'm just going to go through this very, very quickly. What we've been seeing is that there are 3 steps that happen with mindfulness training, and these are steps that anybody can follow. So I just want to go through these really quickly. First step is becoming aware of these habit loops. If we're not aware of these, we can't change our behaviors. The second step is exploring the results of these behaviors, and I'll talk about why this is so critical in a moment. And then the third step is actually stepping out using mindfulness training. So step 1, and I'm going to use some examples from folks who actually use our online community and journal about their experience because it really helps us understand what they're going through. Here's somebody who wrote in their journal, I understand why I go to food, to avoid or cover up or distract from uncomfortable feelings such as anger, sadness, or restlessness. Who wants to feel those things? Trigger, uncomfortable feeling, behavior, eat something that temporarily diminishes the feeling. Rewards, still have to deal with the unpleasant feelings plus the sugar headache. I can clearly see how I got caught in this habit loop trying to escape difficult feelings with food, but that ultimately it doesn't work. What great awareness and the ability to actually start to see how our mind works. For many people, this is critical, just moving their mind from this black box to, oh, I understand how this works now. Step 2, I think of this as the beginning of the end. This involves a part of the brain called the orbitofrontal cortex, which I think of as the BBO part of the brain. It's always looking for a bigger, better offer. And what it does is it determines how rewarding something is and then compares it to everything else. Let's use an example like food, So for my brain, milk chocolate, more rewarding than broccoli. Dark chocolate, yes, whoops. More rewarding than milk chocolate. So my brain sets up this hierarchy, broccoli, milk chocolate, dark chocolate, so it can quickly just see something and says, oh yeah, dark chocolate, milk chocolate, and make a decision to make it efficient. The problem is the only way to change behavior is by bringing awareness back online to help determine how rewarding that behavior is now in present moment. So, for example, somebody just said this pretty clearly, all the cigarettes I smoked today were disgusting. So that reward value is dropping just by bringing awareness in. Here's another example. Do your sneaky habit loop that says eating junk food is fun. I'm on to you, right? So simple awareness practices can really help people transform their behavior, not through grit or brute force, but by simply helping them see clearly. Next step, rewards are more rewarding. As these old reward values start to drop, it opens up the brain to say, okay, give me something better. What's that bigger, better offer? And here I turn, I just want to highlight, we often turn to things outside of ourselves for that relief. So smoke a cigarette, eat some chocolate, whatever. What I would suggest is there are 2 problems here. One is we become habituated to these old behaviors, so we need more. Maybe it's we're bored and we look on Instagram for cute pictures of puppies, and our brain says, okay, I get it, give me cuter puppies, and then it's like, okay, puppies and kittens, and then, what else you got? And it just keeps going, puppies, kittens, babies, whatever. What if we could actually find something that doesn't become habituated and is always available? Here I turn to my muse, Lewis Carroll, who wrote in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, Curiouser and Curiouser. What I would suggest is that that's curious awareness, this attitudinal quality of mindfulness, is intrinsically available and more rewarding than these externally driven behaviors. So what feels better, curiosity or a craving? We can actually, when we have a craving, we can turn to that with curious awareness, and in that moment, flip the valence from unpleasant craving to even less unpleasant or possibly pleasant curiosity. Oh, what's this feel like? This might seem like a tall order, but here's an example of somebody with panic disorder. When I first started the program, I didn't quite buy into the benefits of curiosity. Today, I felt a wave of panic, and instead of immediate dread or fear, my automatic response was, that's interesting. And so you can see how this person was able to replace these old habituated behaviors of worry, of fear, of panic with curiosity. Okay, so in the interest of time, I'm just going to go through this quickly. How does this actually manifest in the brain? I'm going to start with this story of an Olympic hurdler. Her name is Lolo Jones. She was actually favored to win the 2008 Olympics. And she has a really fascinating story. And I'm just going to summarize an interview she gave with Time magazine after the Olympics. So she had made it to the finals, all the way to 9th of 10 hurdles, and she was actually in the lead in the finals at the Olympics. And she said, I was just in an amazing rhythm. It wasn't like, I'm about to win the Olympic gold medal. It just seemed like another race. And then there was a point after that where I was telling myself to make sure my legs were snapping out. So I overtried. That's when I hit the hurdle. So the critical point here is, mindfulness and this curious awareness isn't about changing anything. It's about changing our relationship to whatever's happening. Lolo Jones literally got in her own way. She got caught up in her thinking. Now, or as this teacher put it, your me is in the way. In fact, there's this continuum of getting caught up. Think of daydreaming. We get caught up in daydreaming. Somebody says, hey, snap out of it. We snap out. We get caught up in stress. Boy, wouldn't that be great if somebody said, hey, snap out of it, and suddenly we're not stressed. So you can feel that caught up a little bit more strongly. And then the far end of the spectrum, addiction. I like this simple definition: continued use despite adverse consequences. We're so caught up that even if we're aware, we can't shake it. We all know what this feels like, right? Here, I'm going to show you, actually, let's reproduce this study. I think we have a large enough N that we could get statistical significance. I'm going to have you just take a moment and remember a time recently when you were anxious or afraid. If you can't think of a time, you might just wonder, how long is he going to keep talking tonight? Because I want to go home. And if that doesn't make you anxious or afraid. So just feel into that and feel where you feel anxiety or fear, okay? And what these folks did was they did a big study to see where people most commonly reported these things, and they showed these in heat maps, basically the likelihood of people pointing out, yes, that's where I feel it. You relate to that fear and anxiety. Now this actually makes sense physiologically. If we're being chased by the proverbial saber-toothed tiger, our job is to make ourselves as small as possible so we can protect our vital organs. So we all know what this contracted, caught-up feeling feels like. And if we're doing it, any time from daydreaming to getting caught up in stress or craving, we can actually measure this neurobiologically. I won't go into all the details, but there's a network of brain regions called the default mode network that's activated during self-referential processing, basically when we're worried about the future, when we're regretting the past, or also when we're getting caught up in craving. For example, it gets activated when you show people who are addicted to cocaine pictures of people smoking crack cocaine. It gets activated, it shows up, lights up like a Christmas tree in smokers who are shown smoking imagery. Same for pathological gambling, and even for chocolate. One of my friends who's a food researcher at Yale, she did this for a Ph.D. where she basically fed people chocolate in a PET scanner, asked them how much they liked it, and of course, she was feeding them their favorite chocolate, so they start the experiment. They're like, this is great, 10 out of 10, this is great. And she kept feeding them and feeding them and feeding them, and eventually, by the end of the experiment, they're like, what did I sign up for? I hate science, I'm never doing this again. They're reporting this as negative 10 out of 10. Interestingly, this part of the brain called the posterior cingulate, one of the hubs of the default mode network, was activated at both ends of that spectrum. So if you remember back to that pathway diagram, wanting more and wanting less, both that wanting piece, that getting caught up in wanting, seems to activate this default mode network. So, we started asking this question, well, is this actually the brain region involved in getting caught up in our experience, the posterior cingulate cortex, this hub of the default mode network? And we studied a bunch of experienced and novice meditators to see if this was actually, if this was part of it. And then the nice thing about mindfulness training is that it's literally designed to help us not get caught up in things. So long story short, when we looked at across the entire brain, the only differences that we found, there were only 4 brain regions that were different between experienced and novice meditators. 2 of those 4 were the main hubs of the Feldman network, and they were deactivated in experienced versus novice meditators. So here we're seeing they're literally not getting caught up in this activity as much. We could go on to study this prospectively in people with addictions. For example, people trying to quit smoking, we could bring them in, show them smoking imagery, measure their activity in their posterior cingulate cortex, randomize them to get mindfulness training or the National Cancer Institute's app, scan them a month later and see if we could actually predict their outcomes based on brain activity. Long story short, we saw a nice correlation between reduction in brain activity and reduction in cigarettes smoked only in the active mindfulness group. And we also saw that there was a dose-dependent relationship. The more modules they completed, the better they did. Again, only in the mindfulness group. The other group completed the same number of modules, but we saw no effect there. So here we're linking up theory with mindfulness training, even delivered through an app, that links to brain mechanisms which could actually predict clinical outcomes. So I'm just going to end by saying we can actually start to link up these people's subjective experience with their brain activity as a way to one, make sure we're not fooling ourselves. You know, as a meditator myself, you know, I could just be doing this to justify my existence or all this time I spent struggling in my mindfulness practice. Or we could actually see if this could be clinically useful. And so we, with the help of one of my colleagues when I was at Yale, Jennings Papadimitrios, we developed a paradigm where we could actually give people feedback from their posterior cingulate in real time while they're meditating to see if their subjective experience actually lined up with their brain activity. We do a bunch of control experiments. I won't show you those in the interest of time. And we were fortunate enough to have Anderson Cooper come in and try this out for a piece that 60 Minutes was doing on mindfulness training a couple of years ago.
This is just the next generation of exercise. We've got the physical, exercise components down, and now it's about working out how can we actually train our minds.
Dr. Brewer is trying to understand how mindfulness can alter the functioning of the brain. He uses a cap lined with 128 electrodes.
We're going to start filling each of these 128 wells with conduction gel.
The electrodes are able to pick up signals from the posterior cingulate, part of a brain network linked to memory and emotion.
This is all just picking up electrical signal from the top of your head.
Since attending the mindfulness retreat, I'd been meditating daily and was curious to see if it had an impact on my brain.
We're going to have you start with thinking of something that was very anxiety-provoking for you.
Okay. When I thought about something stressful, the cells in my brain's posterior cingulate immediately started firing, shown by the red lines that went off the chart on the computer screen.
Just drop into meditation.
Okay. When I let go of those stressful thoughts and refocused on my breath, within seconds, the brain cells that had been firing quieted down, shown by the blue lines on the computer.
That's really fascinating to see like that.
Dr. Brewer believes everyone can train their brains to reach that blue mindfulness zone, but he says all the technology we're surrounded by makes it difficult.
The best part about that experiment was we had Anderson Cooper gooped up with our electrode gel and all this for about 2 to 3 hours. He pulls the cap off and does something with his hair, and suddenly it's perfect again. So I just want to bring this to a close. What this suggests is we actually know a whole lot about how our minds work. And it's actually relatively simple in terms of the processes that drive a lot of habitual behaviors. And we also know that mindfulness training can actually target this. We can find these behavioral mechanisms, we can find these brain mechanisms, and even bring these together. So I'll just end with my patients. Obviously, if they didn't do well, I wouldn't tell you about them. But my patient with binge eating disorder, she was actually one of the pilots when we were developing this mindful eating program. She lost about 40 pounds, but what was remarkable was she said, I feel like I actually have my life back. I can eat a single piece of pizza and actually enjoy it. The critical piece here was, it's not avoiding whatever the trigger is, it's learning how to work with that relationship to it. My patient that was referred for anxiety, remember with panic disorder, he also had generalized anxiety disorder. 2 weeks, so I sent him home with some mindfulness training. We gave him our own running anxiety app. It's just to map how his mind worked. And 2 weeks later, he came back and he had this smile on his face, and he said, "I lost 14 pounds." And I was kind of confused because I said, "I thought we were working on anxiety." And he said, "Yeah, I mapped out my mind and I realized I was actually eating as a way to cope with my anxiety, and it wasn't working, so I just stopped doing that." Over the course of the subsequent 5 months, he went on to lose 80 pounds. Became normotensive, like his hypertension went away because he lost all that weight, and his fatty liver became normal. He also did a great job of working with his anxiety. And I was walking out, our School of Public Health in Providence, Rhode Island is right on one of the main streets. And I was walking out of class one day into the courtyard next to the street, and this guy drives up, rolls down his window, and goes, "Hey, Dr. Judd." It was my patient, who is now, I'm not kidding, an Uber driver. So if that's not a success metric, I don't know what is. Yeah. So I will end. I think there were so many sages on which we could stand on their shoulders. I love this poem by Rumi. It talks about a worm, digs into eating grape leaves. Suddenly he wakes up, call it grace, whatever, something wakes him. He's no longer a worm. He's the entire vineyard, the orchard too, the fruit, the trunks, a growing wisdom and joy that does not need to devour. Beautiful portrayal of how we can move from this contracted, closed-down quality, whether it's craving or getting caught up in worry or fear or whatever, to kindness, to connection, to curiosity. And of course, I want to thank all the folks that contributed to all this work and our funders. Most of this work was funded by the NIH. And of course, Mary Oliver is wonderful poet who died earlier this year, leads us with some very simple life lessons. And if you want more information on the research or the papers or anything else, we've got a bunch of free resources on my website, including free CME courses for healthcare providers. You can check that stuff out. So I'll stop there, and thank you for your attention.
I know everybody is ready to go home, so we won't keep you. We're wrapping up now. But I do want to close with something that we feel is important for you to know. You've just enjoyed some amazing speakers and some amazing wisdom, so thank you to all of you who came here and helped us with this. But I'd also like to call to mind now my mentor, John Kabat-Zinn, who pioneered the mindfulness-based stress reduction in 1979. His dedication to widening the circle of mindfulness to alleviate suffering and transform lives has led to remarkable professional interest. It's upon his shoulders that we stand. Perhaps this evening's gathering of hearts and minds, our hearts and minds here tonight, will help us begin a personal inquiry about whether we can become more mindful human beings. Asking ourselves, would it be possible to carry the banner of mindfulness for an evolution right here in South Florida? Perhaps joining together, this is being done in Europe and in other parts of this country, joining together in a Mindful South Florida initiative that Gus and I have hoped and continue to hope may arise from this event, if not now, perhaps soon. As John Kabat-Zinn says, interest in mindfulness generally, and in MBSR and other mindfulness-based programs is spreading around the world everywhere at a lightning pace. So in addition to sowing seeds, we need orchards where we can grow things in a more structured and planned way. I think about my friend, he was mentioned earlier, and he says he loves you, Tish. The Congressman Tim Ryan from Ohio, he came to Miami first in 2013 to talk about his book, A Mindful Nation. In that, he stresses that mindfulness training makes a valuable investment in the most important asset that we have, well-functioning human beings, meaning both adults and children. So thank you all for joining us here this evening. Perhaps this gathering will ignite the intention to call forth all of you here who might be interested, committed, willing to dialogue or work together in a call to action. Maybe helping connect the many scattered points of light in South Florida into a stronger, more effective force for healing, well-being, good mental health, well-functioning human beings and communities. If anything that you have heard this evening has resonated with you, we hope that you'll give it some thought and let us know, perhaps if you're interested in becoming part of a South Florida Mindfulness Coalition. And if you are interested in this evening or other work that we might be doing, and you feel that you've been touched and want to help, all donations, no matter how small, are gratefully accepted. So thank you all.